Good afternoon, everybody. We're running 4 minutes late. And those 4 minutes are very valuable when you're in the last session, last 60-minute session of the conference. So here we are, after almost 3 days intensive discussion, and I can guarantee that we will be fired and inspired by the final session by Rukmini Banerji, whose name I have spelt incorrectly in the program, and I apologize very sincerely. Rukmini is the Chief Executive Officer of the Pratham organization, which is a non-government organization focused on children's education and youth skilling in India. And a very important activity of Pratham is the ASA evaluations assessments, and I'm sure that we will be hearing about those in Rukmini's presentation. The title of the presentation is Language and Learning, the Challenges of Primary Education in India. Rukmini will talk for 40 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes left for questions and discussion. So I'll hand over directly to Rukmini.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon to everyone. You've been in a test match is 5 days. I don't think you have anything for 3 days, but you've survived 3 days and the stadium is still full, which puts a lot of pressure on the last wicket partnership here to at least keep you till tea time. So this is my job, and thank you so much for being here. I'm always a little bit intimidated at such events because, and it is well known that I know nothing about language, and yet British Council thinks it's important to invite me. So I'm very indebted to you for allowing somebody who, we all have to deal with language, but I claim no expertise in language. To come and speak at a premier conference like this. But what I thought I would do is to actually put at the end of my speech a bit of a wish list in front of people like you, that practitioners like me who are in the field and who often wish they had more weapons, more strategies, more ideas and more resources, I've tried to compile a list of those and bring so that when you leave from here, you at least have my wish list with you. And so the next conference, if British Council should invite me back, perhaps there will be some dividend from the talks here. What I thought I would do is just share with you some of the challenges and contexts. Many of you work with children, perhaps, so some of this is not new to you at all. But we work across India, we work both in rural and urban areas, and we work largely with young children, primary school-age children. And so looking at a whole cross-section of these experiences, I thought I would just pull out some, share with you how we interpret these situations, and also perhaps a little bit about the strategies that we've begun to use, and then end it with a kind of a wish list. So first, if I talk a little bit about contexts, this is, as you can recognize, a slum area in Bombay. I started my life with education and kids in places like these. And I remember many years ago, almost 20 years ago, a colleague of mine from when I used to work in America before that, she was an early literacy expert. And she came to visit. And I remember walking down these lanes with her, and her name was Rebecca Barr. She was an American scholar. She continuously would try to fit her theoretical underpinnings of what she thought was the right thing with the context that she saw. And I remember in a lane not unlike this one, where we had a heated argument about home language and school language. And I looked at these homes and I said, it's very difficult to say in places like this that there is a home language. There is certainly a gully language, which is the language of the lane. There is certainly a mother tongue, whatever the mother speaks. But sometimes the mother tongue and the father tongue were different because the father spoke different things. And sometimes my older brother and older sister tongues were also different because they had different kinds of friends. And these children, at least orally, were so, they may not have been adept at any one language, but they seemed to navigate so easily between so many of the languages that they heard in a slum, densely crowded slum environment like this. And I remember challenging her to say that her theoretical frameworks, which presumably are, some of the theoretical frameworks that are used world over, did not fit this circumstance. And so, who was responsible for creating the theoretical frameworks that would help people like us to work here? Unfortunately, my colleague passed away a few years after that, but this question has continued to haunt me, and every time I walk down streets like this, I feel ill-equipped I feel perfectly equipped to talk to the children and have fun with them, but I feel very ill-equipped to know what is the right strategy to deal with not just the kids, but their families and so on, so as to strengthen the richness of the environment they are coming from and not take away from it. A different environment far away from Bombay. This is a school in a village in Dhanbad district in Jharkhand. And I know there have been presentations at this conference from Jharkhand. Because I spend a lot of time with kids, I like to think that I'm quite good with kids. But the good thing about working with kids is that they keep you quite humble. And just as you think that you're very good with them, something happens that makes you question your own abilities. And in this classroom, something like that happened. So I went into this class. This was a mix of first and second and third standard children. And I started talking to them, and I thought I was talking in a very engaging way. They were completely blank faces, and there was no response whatsoever. So I changed my tack. I said something different. No reaction. And I felt like I was in Jharkhand, and I was speaking a very, I'm from Bihar, so my Hindi was not that different, but there was no reaction. And so then it dawned on me that perhaps these children speak some other language. And it turned out that they were more familiar with Bengali, which I also happen to speak. And so once I started speaking in Bengali, they warmed up and they began to react. So then I wrote some Bengali sentences on the board. And we went back to being completely non-responsive. And what we saw there was that these were children who were comfortable in an oral Bengali. But if they had to read, you had to write a Bengali word in Hindi, which, as good Bengalis here, probably people who don't want to write Bengali in Hindi. But you had to adopt some strategies like this to take them along. When we took a walk in their neighborhood, in the village, we found that Bengali was only the language of one of the communities there. There was a big Santali population who obviously spoke Santali at home, also didn't speak Hindi in school, and the scripts that you could see, there wasn't much print in the village, but the scripts that you could see were these Devanagari scripts written in Santali. When I talked to the teachers, the regular teacher was a qualified, had all the right degrees, but was a Hindi speaker, did not speak any of the languages of the children. And so I asked, so what do you do every day? Because within 10 minutes, I was frustrated by being in that classroom. And the teacher very flatly said to me, I do what good teachers are supposed to do, which is to teach from the textbook. And the textbook, of course, was in Hindi as well. Luckily for everyone, there are para-teachers in many of the schools in these states, and the para-teacher was a local person. So really the para-teacher and the children had a whole subterranean life, and the regular teacher and her textbook had a lofty life, where none of the children were engaged. And so thanks to the para-teacher, the kids orally knew a lot of things. In writing, they didn't know very much because they had not used this Hindi, Bengali versions. But again, we left feeling that this whole situation needed so much more that needed to be done. A third context, and I felt I should bring this up, this is for those, I don't know if there's anybody here from Bihar other than Michael. Yeah. So this is a cartoonist. He is people in Bihar recognize him. There's a cartoon by him in every day in the Hindustan newspaper. And he, as turns out, also writes things for children. And he was writing some very simple children's books for Pratham. And we had an argument. I think arguments are good because they make you think, and especially arguments which are unresolved. So we had an argument because he wanted to write it in Bhojpuri. I couldn't find I didn't have a soft copy of the book we were fighting about, but I did pull out one of his cartoons to give you a sense of how he draws and what he writes. And he felt that the story that he was writing should be in Bhojpuri, should be written, it should be Bhojpuri the way that he's written it here. He had a daughter about 4 years old, really for whom the book was actually about her. Her name is Chulbuli, and the story was about Chulbuli making a drawing. And so we decided that there was a big mela going on in Gandhi Maidan, which is the scene, I suppose, today where they are swearing in the new government. And I said, why don't we create 2 versions of the same story, one in Bhojpuri and one in Hindi, and give it to the kids and let's see what the kids say. And he was convinced that the kids would say that the Bhojpuri is better. I was very keen that the kids should have a view. I didn't care one way or the other what the kids said. And what the kids did say, there was a whole range of kids, was that the Hindi one is the way a book should be. The Bhojpuri one is said, but it's never written like this. And so they actually made fun of Pawan because a lot of them were his daughter's kids, so it was okay to make fun of an adult, to say that you don't know, you're not supposed to write books like this, you're supposed to write books like that. But when you talk to us, you can talk to us like this. So we left it unresolved. Eventually, I was able to convince him just to put it in Hindi because it could go much further, both within Bihar and otherwise. But I felt like the kids had a very strong view about what things should be like. And when you looked at the Bhojpuri book, after some time, the kids did not even look at it. They all moved to looking at whether they could read or not. This is another context. Again, I'm sure there are must be somebody here from Assam. This is a area in Assam, in lower Assam, Kokrajhar. If you Google Kokrajhar and click on it, very sadly, I did it last night, all you can see is pictures of violence. Because there has been so much violence there recently, both ethnic violence tied up with language and many other things. That's why I didn't put a picture and I put the map, because there is a lot more to Kokrajhar than the violence. And a colleague of mine has been working there for some time. And she started working there because she was very dissatisfied with the way that we in Pratham were actually dealing with children and in Assam. And she felt that we needed a much more nuanced view of what goes on there. And this is perhaps something that many of you do, but for us as people who were working with children for a long time, it was a big education. That what she did was she spent almost a year just mapping out the different kinds of language use that there were in the 10 villages where we were going to start working to begin with. Some of these language uses I was familiar with. What does your mother speak? What does your father speak? What does your teacher speak? What's the language in the textbook? But there were many others that frankly we had not thought about. And as we went school by school analyzing these, we realized that although it is well known that this is sort of the Bodo land area, there was much more going on there than we had anticipated. So the instruction in the school and the textbook was of the obvious ones. The teachers sometimes could speak more than those two. The teachers had often been taught in totally different languages, so their experience of teaching had not been in any of the languages that they were teaching themselves. But I think the most interesting part to us was there were schools there where the children did not have a common language that they could use together in the playground. Which meant that even in the playground, they were segregated by language, which was also associated with their other background characteristics. So although they were physically in the school together, they occupied completely different worlds. And it took someone who didn't speak any of the languages to go there to bring the children together to cooperate, to try and help this person who was an outsider to really get a sense of what they were doing. I speak several languages, and I have found actually, I'm not suggesting this as a good strategy, but I found that, for example, I speak Marathi quite fluently, but grammatically not very well. And this is a great amusement to children who feel that आप इतने बड़े हो गए हो अभी तक आपको ठीक से आई नहीं. So let us teach you. And that often gets a whole group of children quite united in teaching you what you should have learned. How did you get so big and not know the basic things? So I strongly recommend knowing some language fluently, but not well, to really get close to children, because that, I think, brings out often the best in the kids, to take you along. But as we went on, we also saw that there were, different uses of language in the market, the police station. There, the police station is an important place. A much larger proportion of people have to deal with the police than I think in an average place. The language in which you write FIRs, the language of the newspapers, and add to that, the Bodo script itself is both in Hindi as well as in Devanagari, created a situation where now, once that we knew all these complications, we were almost paralyzed about what was the best thing to do in this situation. So looking at all of this, we have come up with some ways of dealing with our current realities. But I thought I would take a quick detour and just for those who happen to have escaped Asar, give you a little bit of a dose of Asar, because that is my passport to coming here. So I just want to give you a little bit of a taste. This is a big survey we do every year. We've done it for 10 years. This is a break year, because after 10 years, you're entitled to having a break. And we basically ask 3 simple questions. Are children in school, which most children now in India are, but can they read a very simple text? And I'll show you the text. And can they do very basic arithmetic? Because now that our enrollment levels are very high, we can take a look at what is actually happening in school. And all these numbers tell you it's very big, and it happens, everywhere across the whole country, all rural districts. This is just a quick glimpse of the Hindi tool. There is a small story which is roughly at a standard 2 level, and then there are these other things. And the bottom line is that, over these 10 years, not much has changed. If anything, there is a slight declining trend that our children now reach 5th standard, and even in 5th standard, regardless of the language you're in, roughly about half the children can actually read something which is like a simple story. So whichever language we're operating in, we have a long way to go in building this basic capability. And this is not the only capability to build. There are many more things. This is just kind of a tip of the iceberg that gives you a sense of how far we've come. 2011, because this issue of language, clearly is very important with small children and when they're learning to read, we decided to explore a little bit of what the language is at home and what the language is in school. And this, we used sort of the usual categorization. These were the languages that people were asked, do you speak any of these at home? And then I think there were another 122 other languages, which we also asked if you spoke that at home. Now, as someone who doesn't really, delve very deep into language, all the conversation I had heard on multilingual kinds of issues tended all to be either in largely tribal-dominated areas, or in the Northeast, or clearly in areas like Kashmir, where the school language is English, but your home language is, something different. What surprised us that year in the Asar data was that in the Hindi heartland, many people came back saying that they don't speak Hindi. Now, the Asar is a very, very rough and ready tool. We have very large number of surveyors. So I'm not, saying that this is the most accurate way. There have been much more well-done linguistic surveys in India. But I think that the fact that in some of the largest states in India, children actually speak something completely different at home, which means often that and I'll come to that the families speak something different and the teachers speak something different, may account for the fact that our children are making much slower progress in the early years than we would like. Our textbooks are created with, I'm sure the best knowledge there is and goodwill and so on. but they are not doing justice to what the children are coming with. And I don't see, and many of you are experts, I don't see a very serious attempt, especially in the early grades in school, to get at this issue, to really understand what it is that the children are coming with, and what is it that they can. When you actually work with kids, and this happens all the time, if you are listening to them and reading out to them, they replace the words that they don't know with the words that they do if the two languages are close by. But if the structure of both the languages is very different, then what you get is what I got in Dhanbad, is just blank faces and waiting for the bell to go so that you can go outside and have a good time and leave these adults to their own business. A few more facts from Asar also, I think, helps to build the context. This Asar is a rural sample. It ranges between 600,000 to 700,000 children every year. And almost half of the mothers of the children who are currently in school are mothers who have not had much schooling or no schooling. Which means that, again, I'm very surprised that we hear a lot about mother tongue, but we really rarely hear much about mother's voice. It means that the mother is probably proficient in the language in which she operates at home, but not at all comfortable with negotiating with whatever may be in school. And there are fathers as well who don't have schooling, although that number is smaller. Another fact that we found very useful from Asar is that most children in India, other than the textbook, do not have any other print material at home. So which means that our whole attitude to printed material is the attitude you would have if the only print material you had were textbooks. I have nothing against textbooks, but I have to say that that's not the book I would pick to read when I'm going to sleep at night. And therefore, we also have a long way to go in building this kind of, if we want to build reading and we want to build many other language capabilities, we have to keep this in mind, that you don't have really first-hand interaction or exposure to anything other than a textbook. Please don't, textbooks are needed, and I realize that. I realize I'm very, going anti-textbooks here. So, this is all fine. Much of this is well known. Many of you have done much more in-depth research on this. So here is what we have been doing in some of the contexts that I described to you. In Kokrajhar, for example, given this many different, all the different languages, there are some schools in which there is Rabha, Santali, Bodo, Bengali, Nepali. These are all because they are in an area in India where all of these populations do exist. We decided that the best thing to do is to really build your ability to talk. Many of these children don't even talk to each other. And you will talk in the language of comfort. And the language of comfort for you may be a mixed up language. But whatever is comfortable for you seems to be the right place to begin. And our teams there spent a lot of time collecting stories, which meant you had to talk to mothers, you had to talk to grandmothers, you had to talk to anybody who would talk to you to be able to collect what was common in the narratives of those areas. And then it seemed like in such communities, our first job was not teaching reading, not teaching grammar, not teaching language, but teaching how to communicate with each other, teaching how to understand each other, even if we were speaking to each other in things that only we understood half of, and building confidence that we were going to make progress together. Sometimes I find that, in sticking very closely to what, at least in the common world we know as language, we forget some of these things, that how important it is to be able to build children's confidence in being able to express themselves in whatever form and whatever way, so that they can move further with confidence. So we used these kind of known building blocks and moved slowly, often first in completely oral ways, to whatever was the language. In this case, it was Assamese, which was the less comfortable language. And here you can see a great deal of these activities that the children do is to enact, because you can act without having to speak too much as well, but there is comprehension when you're acting in a play or something together. And very often, parents will tell us that you're not teaching our children because the children are having too much fun. But perhaps one of the first things to do is to have some fun, so that then you can move on to the more serious business of whatever this learning is all about. We've been working in about 60 or 70 schools now for 3 or 4 years. And I can tell you that they're all very good performers. Some of them are not good readers yet, but they can tell you a story and they can act it out for you in many different ways. And I think that's an important life skill to have, and I'm convinced that these children will learn reading if they haven't done so already. This is from Jharkhand. It is not from where the earlier picture was. But this is an area in which there is a lot of children who speak Ho. And I've given you a few numbers there, just as indication that we were trying to build for classes 3 to 5, both a basic arithmetic skill and a basic reading skill. And we found that in reading, the children were making progress, but they were still in a certain period of time where we usually see much more progress. They were not moving as fast. But in math, their progress was very quick. And so, clearly these were children who were speaking Ho at home, and we knew that that was an issue. But how do we crack the issue, and how do we figure out what to do next? So we created a version of the tool we normally use, and we tried first, and we've seen this a lot from when we try to speak English in other places, that what we used to think of as difficulties in learning English were actually clearly, which I think is well known in your L1 and L2 kinds of conversations, that there was a great deal of deficit in your first language, which you just assumed that children orally knew their first language well enough, and that this was getting in the way of your second language. And here we found that a lot of these children, who were coming from all kinds of backgrounds, really had a very low word or vocabulary knowledge even in Ho. So to expect that they would know these in Hindi, was a far call. So our first job there seemed to be to really build a much stronger language background in Ho before we could move anywhere else. In terms of even the phonetic sounds, there were clearly overlaps with Hindi, words and sounds that were common in both the languages, and then some sounds that the children just could not even hear, which are some of the ones below. And therefore, all the stories that we were using had to keep this in mind, that if you wanted children to pick up confidence and comprehension, and alongside with that start building some reading skills, you needed to think about what was familiar and what was unfamiliar. And we find this comfortable language and uncomfortable language a little easier than a particular language that we are talking about. So just putting all of this together and sort of trying to create my own wish list, where would we as a large group of practitioners who are very comfortable with children but are not particularly savvy with the theory of how to deal with multiple languages, what should we be doing and what are the big questions in front of us? So I have 4 or 5 items I'd like to place in front of you. One of them is that we find it very useful to just, in every situation, listen very carefully to what the kids are doing. Because there are so many clues from what they can tell us that helps to take us to the next step. Because there are many things that they can do, and building from there seems to be a more productive way for us to proceed, even if they seem to have a leg in several different languages at the same time. We find that ready-made material, I don't know about others, but we find that anything that is printed and becomes, again, sorry to say, like a textbook, seems to get frozen and highly valued, but rarely used. So any ready-made material has that high status, but a little bit of a low use. So what we feel it works better is to develop a healthy strategy which is alive and kicking, which can be taken into a situation and put to work, and that strategy should lead us to what should be done next, rather than a set of ready-made material, which then freezes everybody's initiative. I think ready-made material as reference material is good, but very often ready-made material just makes everybody think that it's all here and I don't need to think on my own. I think the third thing we find is, in a lot of discussions that we hear, we don't necessarily participate, we hear a lot of polarizing of views of this or that. But in the working with kids, we find it's all a long continuum. And we are looking for ways, healthy ways, in which to keep this continuum alive and get deeper, rather than move into this or that. Because children seem to be able to navigate this continuum, perhaps not in the best way that we can help them to do, but it is a continuum. Perhaps English is at one end and your mother's language is at the other end. But in many situations, we are all along this continuum at different paces and different rates. And what is the best way in which we can keep this richness alive rather than get boxed into two different places? And finally, I think, what can we do, and I don't know quite the right way to put this, how can we help theory and practice to grow together? In many cases, we find that the theory grows in one place and the practice goes in other places, and we are trying to fit them two together. But are there ways, are there places, are there people who have grown theory and practice together, have been influenced by the research that has happened before, but are still open to a wide number of ways in which these things can grow? Should universities and people like us be closer together? I know there are many people who have worked very integrally with these language situations, but at least in India, these are deep pockets and they're not spread out. So whether it is in teacher training, whether it is in universities, whether it is in communities, how can this process of theory building and solution making move together in a more effective way that really gives, I would say, really pays the due respect to the richness we are sitting on, rather than what, at least for people from my part of India do, is that you have, we all have two names. I mean, most people who come from Eastern India have two names, one for the home and one for school, and we are very happy with these two names operating in different ways. How can we come together in a way that is more integral and cuts across the different situations in which we are? So I'll stop here. I don't know how we're doing for time, but thank you so much for getting me to speak.
We've moved into the middle so that everybody can see Rukmini. So, as I predicted, a wonderful, rich, dense, thought-provoking presentation, and an absolutely perfect example of how to use PowerPoint. We've got about 20 minutes for questions and discussion. Who would like to begin? Somebody over there. Sorry, because of the lights, I can't see who it is.
Hi, I'm a research scholar from JNU, and my comment is on what you said now, that textbooks are usually, it is a material, it is such a material that is frozen in time, and it kind of gives the hierarchy that, okay, look, that's a prescribed material. I've been on fieldwork to Uttar Pradesh, where I had met these teachers who told me that they have their own implicit ways of using their action in class. So they barely use the TLMs that are given to them, in a very formal, schoolish sort of a manner. And to agree with you, that actually works. And the second thing is that about reading. My work in Uttar Pradesh was on early grade reading, EGR, where an important observation that I saw from 3 districts in Uttar Pradesh that mainly speaks in Hindi is that the para-teachers have taught the same lessons over and over again to one class for such a long time that they have actually rote-learned it. So when I was asking a child that, just pinpoint with your fingers, what are you reading? The child was reading the wrong, the child was pointing out to the wrong word on the book, but was reading in a sequential flow. So the act and practice of reading are two different things. And the third observation that I have about the problems in arithmetic, I was also told that the children are dull in math. I said they cannot be dull in math because they are able to understand quantities, but what they really cannot is read the language of the problem in arithmetic. Until and unless they understood what the problem wanted them to do, they couldn't do math. So that never really meant that they were dull or dumb, they weren't. So what would your, I saw the ASA data, so what do you think would be your understanding on this? Would you say that we continue with
Can you keep the question short?
Oh, yeah,
please?
so would you say that we would continue with more implicit such theories, implicit, how to sort of bring these implicit theories out in the open? What would your understanding on this be?
We'll take a couple of questions and then Rukmini will answer. Anybody else? Why don't you answer that one?
there are obviously teachers who are much more innovative than others. We've done a number of classroom observation studies. My own field experience is largely from UP and Bihar. We recently finished a study of school teachers and classrooms from about 5,000 classrooms in Bihar, where, no doubt there are some teachers who are extremely good teachers, but the predominance of teaching the textbook, dominates over any other kind of behavior. And teaching the textbook, I'm using that deliberately, you're teaching a textbook, whatever is in the textbook, often to kids who are at least 3 or 4 grade levels below. And in many of our systems, I think the way that a teacher is evaluated is to say, if this is now November, have you finished half of the textbook content that you have? So I'm sure there are very good teachers everywhere, but I think there is also a very dominant teaching pattern, which is to say that there is a grade level textbook, and I, as the teacher of that standard, I'm going to teach these chapters one after the other. And I expect that the children will be able to tell me whatever is in that content without my actually having any active engagement strategies for discussion, for expression of any type. If you look at writing, all of this is completely driven by what lies in the textbook.
Thank you. Any more questions, comments? Yeah. Bonnie.
Possibly, if you don't mind, just a comment, which is that, and an elaboration, just to say that you began your talk by saying, you know nothing about language, and I would like to say you know absolutely everything about language. And I think that it's precisely these kinds of insights that really need to feed into theory and into theory building and into research. It's absolutely remarkably powerful. Just one comment, if I can just add then to the conversation, is that I've done a lot of work with comic books, actually, in the Canadian context. And what I found there, similar to you were talking about different languages, one language is like not really, formal language, and then there's the formal language. It's the same thing with actually comic books and like school book, chapter books. And kids would say they love their comic books, but it's not real reading. But real reading is chapter books, and real reading is difficult reading. But if you enjoy it, then it's not real reading. And interestingly enough, it's a little bit like you were saying with the kids playing. The kids are having far too much fun. So, for me, the issue is about kind of theories of learning. Why is it, and this is obviously crosses nations, because it happens in Canada as well, that there's that notion that if people are enjoying something, they can't possibly be learning. So it seems to me we have to absolutely break down that notion. On the contrary, is that when kids are enjoying something, there's a huge amount of learning going on. So we have to kind of re-theorize what we mean by learning. And we also have to tap in. And what I did with the comic book research was to say, okay, if kids love reading comics, how do we learn from that so that when they read their textbooks, they can be as engaged as they are with the comic books? And the argument that I made on the basis of that research was that kids have to have a sense of ownership. And it's what you were saying, that when kids are reading textbook, you say it's kind of all tied up. There's nothing left for them to add. So how do we have our teaching, encourage teaching, where kids do have a little bit of a sense of ownership, and that not everything that is written in a textbook is necessarily all correct and all, uncontroversial, so to speak. So I think we really need to kind of rethink notions of literacy, of reading, of language, of learning. But thank you so much for such an amazing presentation.
doesn't need to be a question answered. This can be, it's a little difficult to have a chat sitting like this, but I think what you said just reminded me of two more instances that I can just add to what you're saying. In the Assam case, where we had kids who actually didn't have a common language, when they found that my colleague who was actually Assamese speaking, so she couldn't speak directly to them, she happened to be a graphic artist also. That's her kind of other job. So there was a river right next to the school, and she asked the kids, often with gestures, if they knew how to fish. So of course everybody knew how to fish, and I don't quite remember how they communicated that my colleague did not know how to fish. So they decided, and the teacher allowed them to all go and show my colleague how to fish, which they did very well. I mean, she didn't learn how to fish, but they ended up catching some fish very quickly. When they came back to the school, again, I'm not sure how they communicated, they decided to draw out, because Parasmita, my colleague, could not read what they would write, and also the children couldn't really write. They drew almost like an instructional manual of how to fish, and in which, I think we still have it in the office somewhere, different children wrote words that they thought were important in this whole business of fishing. Now, there is no textbook which tells you how to fish. So there was a space to create almost like a how to fish manual, which was created by all the kids together. And it was because they had to rescue this poor woman who didn't know this basic fact of fishing. And, I'm not suggesting that, but wherever you find that children have had the responsibility of creating something together, you get stuff like this coming out. We also use in some of our own teaching learning materials some cards which we call Galti Maaf Sudharo To Sahi. I mean, it's paragraphs with mistakes. Now, when you go to a usual school, teachers get very upset because you're showing children printed material with mistakes in it. Because printed material should be above all this kind of errors. And kids love correcting mistakes. And the whole competition is to say, how many mistakes can you find in this piece of text? And, we haven't tested this, but I'm sure it improves their ability to write whatever it is that is written. So these are I'm sure there are many more ideas of how do you get kids to lead what needs to happen in the classroom, which they do very well, even without any training. Kids don't need training, teachers need training.
My question is about ASER's assessment. When you go to do large-scale assessment, also through lots and lots of community people and so on, I know it's very large-scale. What you arrive at is not terribly pleasing to one's ears. We have been repeatedly told children can't do this, children can't do that. A 7th grade child can only do what grade 2 child is doing. No, a grade 2 child is the other way around. But from what you have been describing, it looks to me that if only we allow teachers to sort of capture what children can do, I think it's very, very rich. It's not such a sad story that we need to tell the whole country and the world. I know it's very tough to get this kind of, small things captured, qualitative things captured, but if we can only enable our teachers to capture, document, and show, I think it's a very different story from what large-scale product-oriented assessments can show. I don't have an answer, but then I think that there are two sides to this whole thing about learning. It's just an observation.
Thank you, Rukmini. I was just looking at that table on home language and school language. It's interesting. It doesn't seem to have any relationship to how the students fare in the ASER test. Himachal Pradesh, which is one of the best performing states, has 88% of the children saying that the school language and the home language are different, and yet it's performing well. Uttar Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh have very low percentages, but clearly they don't. What do you think is happening?
See, we've also been looking at some of this. Himachal also has a large percentage of parents who are educated quite a lot. others don't. I mean, there are many factors which are influencing this. And I think probably the place to look is at the early grades. You know, in first and second, the connection between your home language, between what your parents can do, I mean, clearly there are many correlates. I also think that the ASER data may be quite crude, but even the very preliminary analysis that we've done, it does not show always a one-to-one of if your home language was the same as your school language, you will do better, because there could be so many other contextual things that matter. Now, for example, in the Northeast, where the scripts, maybe Roman script in both languages, is that added advantage or not? And again, you know, when we started doing some of this, we wanted to look at other such work that has been done. Now, others such as Rama says, this is, you know, very large scale and therefore very broad and brush strokes. What we want to do, and we haven't, been able to do this, is to identify a number of border districts across the country, which in every state has border districts, and really look at the two dominant languages on the border and perhaps an English, and do this with more depth, just to look at, you know, deeper ways on some scale to understand that what should the strategies be and where are we. If you saw what we did with our whole, it is also iteratively moved. We can see that, you know, you have one idea, then you do one thing, then you test that, then you come up with some action items out of that, then you move to the next step. And some of this, I think, also trying to understand the situation should also lead to what shall I do next? And that what shall I do next should lead to the what shall I do after that? Because as a group of people who are trying to work with children, you need to be on a learning curve continuously, you know, hopefully a step ahead of what the situation is. And so I look at, you know, very often these assessments are, you know, interpreted in different ways. But at the village level, often this is used to really understand that reading means this. If I have never been to school, I never look at my child's textbook, I tend to think that this is the business of the school. But really, all of this, once the kids read aloud in front of you, you realize that I can understand it. I may not be able to read it, but I can understand it. So, great deal of research still. I think lots has been done, but much more needs to be done on all these variations. And I think much less has been done on the Hindi heartland, where our performance on many education trends is lower, to really look at the issue of language. I think a lot more has been done in other regions than has been done in Hindi. That's at least my understanding.
Thank you. Somebody, I can't see, but there's somebody in the middle there.
Yeah, my name is Jessica. This is just a small question, but you mentioned in the middle of your talk that more than 75% of children have no printed material in their homes, which makes sense upon some reflection, but it's a kind of sad state of affairs. I guess my question for you is, do you have a sense of why that is? Do you think that it is a lack of content in local languages? Is it printing facilities? Is it distribution? Is it low literacy, low interest, lack of money to spend on this? Like, what do you think the problem is? And do you have ideas of how people could get more written materials inside people's homes?
You know, it's probably a lot of those. I can just say that if you look at, again, I'm more familiar with Hindi. There are other regions which have, I think, you know, richer and deeper traditions. But if you look at a Hindi children's book, a large print run is usually, and if you put aside like our National Book Trust, which is the government publishing house, a large print run is 3,000 copies. We have probably in the Hindi area alone 100 million children. If you look, even if you just step out of this hotel and you say you want to buy some children's books, I mean, you're quite close to Connaught Place and to Bengali Market. But in many places, even in large cities, where to buy children's books, which are not, you know, textbooks or, you know, workbooks, is not easy. The children's book market, distribution and so on is not as well developed. But we've had a lot of good experiences with newspapers, because of the formats and the forms that children are very familiar with. Textbooks is one, and newspapers is the other. These are the two print forms, and the religious book is the third. But religious books, we treat very seriously, and we tie them up and we keep them away from children and so on. And some of that behavior, I think, also moves on to anything else which is like a book. School after school, you'll see libraries of schools all very carefully kept away because, books should be respected and should not be torn and so on and so forth. So it would help if we had a law passed which said no children's book should be inside a closed cupboard. I mean, that might help. But that also may be a problem because we don't take our laws very seriously. But I would say that I think within the government school system, a lot is happening on at least having materials available for children to read. There are states which have invested, which are continuing to do so. But we need to, for 240 million children, you need to have, I don't know, somebody should calculate, if every kid in India needs to have one book every night, how many books need to be printed and how many need to be in circulation? And our national, employment guarantee scheme should be libraries and not digging ditches. I think you need to take some brave steps like this. There is a new education policy that is going to be formed, and perhaps some of you are on these committees. I think these are the kind of things we should suggest. Otherwise, we are not going to have people who will enjoy and love reading, whether it is digital or otherwise. You still need something to read.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one very quick question left. And if there's nobody to ask a question, I'll ask it. Throughout this conference, we've heard repeatedly calls for policymakers to be educated, to have their awareness raised. Again and again, we've heard that. We haven't heard many reports of attempts to raise the awareness of policymakers. Could you tell us briefly what Pratham has done in that respect? And how successful you've been?
Can I tell you what we are trying to do? Because I'd like to tell everybody that. We've had all these many years of producing these reports, which, have served some purpose to at least highlight some of the issues. But we feel that there needs to be a much larger scale action on getting children, I think to getting children reading and of course doing math and so on. And by reading, I just don't mean reading, I mean, enjoying, engaging, understanding. For me, reading comes with all of that. And so what we've just launched, and I'm happy to send everybody a link for that, is to say that across the country, we have, more than 600,000 villages. Is it possible in the next couple of months to reach 100,000 communities, to see whether these communities would like to take a look? Is there somebody in 1 lakh villages or communities in India who would like to take a look to see how many children in their neighborhood can read? And if you find that there are some who can't or are struggling in whatever language the child wants to read in, is there somebody who would like to help? So this campaign is being called Lakhon Mein Ek, which roughly means, the literal translation would be 1 in 100,000, but 1 in a million. So are you willing to be 1 in a million and help to figure out if there are children in your community who can read and do basic math? And if not, are you willing to give a little bit of time to do this? So while policy makers need to make up their own minds about all of this, I think in a large way, we have a peculiar situation in India where aspirations from education are rising tremendously. Everybody, regardless of your level of education, wants a lot more for their children, and you feel that education and schooling is going to give that to you. On the other hand, you think that somebody else is going to do that. Whether it's a private school, whether it's a tutor, whether it's a government school or a teacher, that somehow I will pay for somebody else or encourage somebody else to educate my child in a different way. I think we have to create really, I feel, a community-based approach to saying that, this needs to be done by all of us. And I feel that the ground is quite ripe because part of this whole Asar thing, when it comes to the public, it looks like a report. But it's actually a massive adventure of looking at what are people thinking, who says what. Innumerable number of times in the last 10 years, I've had old ladies in the village take the tool from me and say, I'm going to read, come back next year. I'll show you that I can read this. We just need a huge reading movement in the country, which will then spur off, I think, many of the things that will, take us in these directions. Now, what needs to be done to do that? Will policymakers change India, or will we change India? I'd like to think we can change India faster than the policymakers. And this campaign that we are trying to do, we find that the most enthusiastic people are the ones that you'd least expect. We have children, school children, high school children, who are very enthusiastically, who themselves can read and feel this should be done by everybody. We find there are people who are not reading themselves, who feel that, okay, I can't, but everybody else should be. So all kinds of people who you don't think are the people who would lead this seem to be taking the most interest. So the big challenge will be, how do you support such people to take the next step? And I would like policymakers to also join, but I think we as common people need to take a look around and say, if somebody's not reading around me, I need to do something. And that something doesn't need to be boring, it could be fun.
Absolutely wonderful, thank you. So we end on a call for action, I think which we all have to take home to our respective countries. Thank you very much indeed, absolutely wonderful. And my last job is to present 2 little gifts to you. Should we do this standing up?
Thank you.
And now I'll hand over to the committee.
The cricket match is not over.
There's a closing.